A trapper, alone on a Montana river, suddenly senses he's not alone. The night is carrying someone toward him. The brittle ice beneath him is cracking, the timberline behind him is shifting, and time is running thin. 40 feet of frozen water becomes his only shield against the men closing in. One wrong step ends everything, and on this night, silence may be his last advantage. The cold pressed into him with the kind of sharpness that only the northern territories deliver, a cold capable of stripping judgment from men within minutes. Temperatures hovered well below zero, and the wind drifting over the river carried a dry, cutting edge. Calder knew this river intimately. He had trapped along its bends for 3 seasons and had crossed it more times than he could count. But tonight it was no crossing point. Tonight it was a barrier, a shield, and possibly a grave if misjudged. The ice looked solid in the moonlight, but Calder knew better. Ice always had 2 faces, the one it showed and the one it hid. His camp was small and discreet, set back among the cottonwoods and shielded by a natural rise of frozen brush. It had taken him only an hour to prepare, but he had built it with the kind of discipline that came from decades spent living far from any town. Snow had been tamped flat under his sleeping area, and his fire pit was little more than coals beneath a heavy canvas to prevent sparks or light. A man who survived winters this way knew how to live with the land instead of against it. But even with all that discipline, something had unsettled him before he lay down to rest. It was the silence, the deep, unnatural quiet of a night when animals should have been moving. Even the wind had paused, as if waiting for something. Calder crouched low and studied the faint shadows shifting at the timberline across the frozen river. He didn't need to see their faces to know they were men. Their behavior gave them away. No lantern flicker, no campfire glow, no scattered formation. They were moving in a tight line, keeping to the deeper darkness, advancing with the patience of predators who believed their prey didn't know they were coming. Calder's breath slowed. Raiders. Not the opportunistic sort, but the practiced kind who hunted in teams and survived on intimidation. Their presence meant trouble, and trouble meant motion. But motion on river ice was a language with its own rules, and breaking them could cost a man his life. He ran a gloved hand across the icy surface near his boots, feeling the subtle vibrations that pulsed upward through the frozen sheet. The river was alive beneath the calm surface, always in motion, always shifting with the night's temperature. Calder had learned long ago that reading ice required both hearing and touch. The low groan he'd felt a few minutes earlier had told him everything he needed. Somewhere between the 2 banks lay a weakness, a line invisible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years hauling traps, gear, and pelts across frozen waterways. That weakness could break under weight, and the men advancing towards him had no idea what they were stepping into. Calder eased backward, careful not to let the snow crunch under him. He moved with the economy of someone who had spent his youth sneaking through Appalachian hollows, then decades perfecting silence as a necessity rather than a technique. His boots stayed low, sweeping rather than lifting. His breath was short and controlled, expelled in slow streams so it wouldn't plume into visible clouds. He slipped into the shadow of a fallen pine and steadied his breath. The raiders were close enough now that he could sense their rhythm. 8 men, maybe 9, moving with confidence. Confidence was dangerous. Overconfidence was fatal on ice. It wasn't fear that made Calder still. It was calculation. A trapper survived by thinking through the terrain, by turning the land into his ally when he had no other. The river offered him a single advantage. It created distance, a fragile threshold that required understanding to cross. Calder had no intention of letting these men cross easily. If he moved too early, they would scatter. If he moved too late, they might flank him. But if he moved at the perfect moment, the river itself would do most of the work. He glanced upward at the moon, noting its position. The hour was late. The temperature would continue dropping. Ice grew brittle under rapid temperature change, especially after long days of thaw-freeze cycles. This stretch of river had seen at least 3 significant shifts in the past week. Calder had felt one yesterday when a deep crack rolled through the ice while he was setting a snare line. That memory returned to him now with sharp clarity. There were seams beneath the surface, fault lines waiting for pressure. The raiders were nearly to the bank, close enough that Calder could make out their outlines more distinctly. They moved with certainty, not caution, suggesting they believed they had the upper hand. People who thought they had control often ignored the ground beneath them. Calder stayed motionless, listening, watching for their next move. His pulse slowed even further, matching the river's subtle cadence. He needed them to commit. Half measures wouldn't work. The ice required full weight before it revealed its weakness. Then something caught Calder's eye in the snow near his camp. A second track line. Fresh, heavy. Not from the raiders across the river. From someone else. Someone who had approached his camp earlier than these men. The depth of the prints told him the person had been carrying weight. The width suggested a man, not small, not hurried, and moving deliberately. The fact that he hadn't heard them was unsettling. Calder knelt slowly, tracing the edges of the tracks with gloved fingers, feeling the crispness of their outline. Fresh, too fresh to ignore. The river wasn't the only threat tonight, and as that realization settled over him, the timberline across the ice shifted again, the raiders breaking into a formation he recognized instantly. They were preparing to cross, and Calder had just discovered he wasn't alone on his side of the river at all. Calder Reeves had never considered himself remarkable, yet the land had shaped him into someone few understood. Raised in the rugged folds of the Appalachian backcountry, he grew up learning to read ridgelines the way other children learned to read books. His early years were marked by long treks across forested hollows, guided by a father who lived by a code of quiet observation and steady resolve. When Calder left home at 17, he carried that code with him, letting it guide him westward to the territories where winters hardened men and the wilderness taught lessons without mercy. As he moved deeper into the frontier, Calder discovered that the silence of open country held more information than most voices ever did. He learned to judge weather by the shift of wind across a valley, to sense animals by the faint disturbances they left behind, and to understand danger by the absence of sound rather than the presence of it. Snowstorms taught him patience, lean seasons taught him discipline, and the endless miles of river ice he crossed each winter taught him that nothing in the wilderness stayed the same for long. His years west of the Missouri were not defined by grand battles or dramatic confrontations. Instead, they were shaped by the slower, quieter trials that tested a man's ability to stay alive when daylight vanished early and temperatures fell to numbers that drained strength from the unprepared. Calder trapped beaver and muskrat along a route that stretched nearly 20 miles. He hauled pelts across snowfields where winds reached 40 miles per hour, and he memorized each creek bend and ridge curve until the land felt more like a living map than a landscape. Along his travels, he crossed paths with indigenous families whose winter skills surpassed anything he had known in his youth. They taught him to read wind-scoured drifts for hidden hollows, to identify the subtle tonal differences in ice when it was thickening or thinning, and to move with a kind of respectful stillness that came not from fear, but from understanding one's place in a larger system. Calder carried those teachings carefully, never claiming them as his own, always acknowledging the knowledge had been shared with intention and trust. He survived blizzards that dropped snow in drifts taller than a man, and he endured stretches of isolation where days passed without sight of a single track. Yet he never treated the land as hostile. To him, it was a teacher, a partner, sometimes stern, but never cruel without reason. That perspective saved him more than once, especially during the nights when the cold pressed so sharply that the smallest mistake could spiral into disaster. Calder understood these lessons deeply, and when danger came, he relied on them without hesitation. By the time he reached the Montana Territory, Calder had sharpened his instincts into something close to a second language. He could read tension in the air before storms, detect subtle changes in animal patterns, and assess the strength of ice by the quality of its echo. These abilities were not gifts, they were earned through repetition, hardship, and the quiet acceptance that survival favored those who listened more than they spoke. In a region where winter shaped every decision, that mindset mattered. As harsh as the land could be, the people Calder encountered shaped him just as strongly. Trappers he met along trading posts shared cautionary tales of men who moved too quickly on early-season ice or who trusted weather that shifted without warning. Elders from winter camps explained the ways animals used terrain to conserve heat and how those same patterns could guide a traveler exposed to dangerous winds. Even solitary wanderers offered glimmers of insight, teaching Calder that wisdom in the frontier arrived in fragments rather than declarations. In time, Calder learned to trust his observations over assumptions. He knew that a quiet forest might signal predators nearby, that thin patches of ice often formed beneath snow that looked deceptively solid, and that a shift in the river's song meant its undercurrent was changing. These skills formed the foundation of his confidence, not arrogance, but preparedness. He measured every step with intention, and that intention kept him grounded on nights when uncertainty pressed close enough to feel like a presence in the dark. What set Calder apart from many who tried their luck in the territories was not fearlessness, but awareness. He noticed details others dismissed: a subtle shift in snow texture near riverbanks, the unusual quiet of a valley that should have echoed with wind, the lingering warmth of a track pressed into a drift only minutes earlier. These signs informed his decisions, helping him stay ahead of situations that might have turned dangerous. His skill wasn't guesswork, it was the cumulative weight of experience and attention sharpened over years. Still, even with all his understanding, Calder knew the wilderness could humble anyone. He respected that truth and stayed adaptable, adjusting his routines depending on temperature, snowfall, or wind direction. That flexibility kept him from becoming predictable, a trait that mattered when others moved through the same land with motives far different from his own. The frontier did not reward complacency, it rewarded vigilance, and Calder's vigilance was why he sensed a disturbance in the night long before he saw the raiders shifting through the timberline. That instinct, honed through years of observing patterns others overlooked, prepared him for challenges that arrived without warning. He understood that a night could change in an instant, turning familiar terrain into a maze of shifting risks. The sound of a branch settling under frost, the faint echo of movement across distant ice, the unusual stillness of animals that should have been active. All these details guided him as surely as any map. And on this night, those clues converged in a way he could not ignore, urging him to act with caution and purpose. What he sensed next would shift the entire night's direction for him. The raiders moved with a precision that revealed their intentions long before their forms became clear. Calder Reeves watched them from his concealed vantage, reading their behavior the way he might study the tracks of wary animals crossing a narrow valley. They were not wandering opportunists drifting through the night in search of mischief, but an organized group following a deliberate path. Their spacing, their pace, and the consistent sweep of their line through the trees hinted at discipline rather than impulse. Even at a distance, Calder sensed they were confident in their numbers and their approach. Confidence like that could make them careless, yet it could also make them more dangerous if not understood properly. As the shadows thickened along the opposite bank, Calder noted how the raiders adjusted their formation. They did not clump together the way inexperienced men tended to do in the cold. Instead, they kept a steady rhythm, each man maintaining a measured distance, as if they'd practiced this night maneuver many times before. The moonlight caught on a few glints of metal, maybe buckles, maybe straps, but not a single lantern showed. The absence of artificial light told Calder everything about their strategy. They wanted silence and invisibility, aiming to move undetected until the moment they chose to reveal themselves. In the wilderness, that level of intentional concealment said more than any spoken plan. Calder's breath slowed as he continued to study them. Years of living among shifting landscapes had trained him to recognize patterns others would overlook. The raiders' stride lengths were nearly uniform, suggesting men accustomed to long treks. Their alignment implied communication without speaking, a trait that only grew out of experience. And their cautious advancement toward the riverbank indicated they believed they had the advantage, or at least the element of surprise. But in their careful movements, Calder noticed another detail.
Their leader's stride left deeper impressions even at a distance. Someone larger or heavier was among them, someone whose role mattered enough that he stayed positioned slightly ahead of the others, guiding their path. The forest behind them remained still, its silence unbroken by any wildlife that might normally stir at this hour. Calder recognized the pattern immediately. The raiders had been moving for some time, and their coordinated presence had already prompted animals to retreat into deeper cover. That withdrawal left a corridor of unnatural quiet in their wake. Calder had learned throughout his trapping seasons that silence in the wilderness wasn't always natural. Silence often signaled something approaching long before it became visible. Tonight confirmed that lesson with chilling clarity. The raiders halted briefly in the shadows of two large pine trunks. Their leader crouched low, examining something on the ground, though Calder couldn't see what it was. Then the group shifted again, angling slightly toward the narrowest point of the river's frozen surface. That shift revealed their intention. They sought the shortest crossing. They hadn't yet recognized the danger that lurked beneath the glossy sheet of ice stretching across the river. They had no way of knowing the ice had weakened over the last few days, subtly thinning in the center where the current moved swiftly beneath. But Calder knew. The faint groan he had felt earlier confirmed it, and now the raiders marched directly toward that fragile section without hesitation. He lowered himself further into the shadow of the fallen pine, understanding that their proximity meant he had to avoid even the smallest sound. In winter night silence, the crunch of a single misplaced boot could betray location instantly. He kept his breathing shallow and measured, mindful of the plume his breath could form if released too forcefully. His senses sharpened with each passing second, every detail of the raiders' approach becoming clearer. How one man favored his left foot, how another kept touching his coat's inner pocket, how their leader's posture remained steady despite the cold. Calder recognized that sort of steadiness. It belonged to someone who trusted his plan. Yet, in all their precision, the raiders failed to notice something critical. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Extreme cold made ice deceptive. It could appear solid in moonlight, its surface glistening like polished glass, but beneath, pockets of weakness thinned with each fluctuating degree. Calder had spent enough nights near this river to anticipate these shifts. He remembered moments when ice that looked sturdy had cracked under the weight of a small pack, while other areas had held firm despite heavier loads. The river was unpredictable, which made it the perfect barrier if understood correctly, and a dangerous trap if misinterpreted. The raiders paused again, their forms nearly merging into the darkness around them. Calder scanned their alignment carefully. There were 8 of them. The even spacing, the disciplined formation, and the efficiency of their movements meant they were accustomed to operating at night. Men who practiced night travel rarely wasted steps. They likely believed the darkness made them invisible, unaware that a man trained by years of quiet observation could detect their presence with little more than intuition and pattern recognition. Their strength lay in numbers and coordination. Calder's strength lay in understanding the terrain better than any map could provide. He shifted his attention to the river's surface. The ice reflected the faint moonbeam, creating a dull shimmer that looked smooth but revealed subtle dark patches if one stared long enough. Those darker areas marked thinner sections, places where the river's current had eroded strength from below. Calder had learned to read these variations by combining visual cues with sound. The earlier vibration he sensed had confirmed the central weakness. If the raiders stepped into that zone with their combined weight, the ice would respond the way a rope responds to sudden pressure. It wouldn't break instantly. It would warn first, a low groan rippling outward before the surface fractured in a line that raced across the river like a branch snapping in a quiet forest. Calder could almost hear it already, imagining how the pressure would build with each step they took. But his thoughts returned to the uncertain detail he had discovered earlier, the fresh tracks near his camp. Someone else had approached before the raiders appeared. That meant the situation was more complicated than he initially believed. The raiders were not his only concern. Whoever left those tracks might still be close, hidden in the tree line or concealed among the brush. Their presence introduced a layer of unpredictability. Calder disliked unpredictability, especially on freezing nights where every decision mattered. The raiders shifted again, this time stepping fully into view as they positioned themselves along the bank. Their leader raised a hand to signal the next move. It was a simple gesture, but it revealed the exact moment they prepared to commit to the crossing. Calder felt the night hold its breath, as if waiting to witness the outcome. The raiders had chosen their point, unaware of the danger beneath their boots, and Calder, concealed in the shadows, knew that the river itself was about to become part of the night's unfolding story. Just before the first raider stepped forward, Calder sensed another faint vibration through the ground, a soft tremor coming from somewhere behind him. It was so subtle he might have missed it if not for years of training. But he didn't miss it, and what that vibration meant was clear. Someone else was moving on his side of the river too, and they were closer than he had thought. The raiders would cross soon, but the real threat might already be within reach.
Calder Reeves had always believed that the land revealed its secrets to those who paid attention, and on nights like this, the river became a living instrument for anyone patient enough to read its signals. The moonlight stretched thin across the frozen surface, outlining the faint spiderweb of cracks that formed a hidden network beneath the smooth veneer. Most men would have seen only a glittering sheet of winter stillness, but Calder saw the delicate balance between strength and fragility. He saw where the ice thickened near the banks, where the surface rippled slightly over a deeper current, and where the pale glow dulled into shadow just enough to warn of a weakness concealed below. The river, silent and unmoving on the surface, was a shifting force waiting to respond to weight and pressure in ways that could be predicted if one knew how to look. Years spent crossing rivers in the harshest winters had taught Calder that ice spoke in its own language. It communicated through vibrations, subtle variations in tone, and the faintest margins of temperature change. Earlier that evening, he had felt a low groan beneath his boots, a tremor that most people would have dismissed as settling ice. But Calder understood that such vibrations indicated an underlying seam beginning to strain, a seam that could widen under pressure or remain stable if left untouched. Now, as the raiders drew closer to the river's edge, he recognized that seam as the critical fault line that might determine the outcome of the night. It stretched across the narrowest 30-foot span, a deceptively simple span that looked like an easy crossing point to anyone unfamiliar with winter rivers. He studied the angle of the moonlight once more, observing how it revealed faint shifts in surface color. The ice closest to the bank carried a bluish tint, a sign of its strength, where cold temperatures had built layers thick enough to hold steady loads. But toward the center, the tone shifted to a muted gray, nearly invisible to an untrained eye. That dullness signaled trapped air pockets, weak points formed when fluctuating temperatures prevented solid freezing. Calder could almost trace the pattern from memory, recalling the day when warm midday sun had softened the ice before the temperature plummeted at dusk. Those rapid changes created inconsistencies that now lay hidden beneath the surface, creating a dangerous path for anyone who assumed the river was uniformly solid. Calder crouched lower, positioning himself so he could maintain a clear view of both the approaching raiders and the precarious stretch of ice. His awareness sharpened as he listened for the faint cues that might guide his next move. The slightest creak or shift could tell him whether the ice was ready to respond to pressure. He leaned forward, gloved hand skimming along a thin crack near his boots, feeling the cold ridges where stress had fractured the surface at a shallow depth. That crack was not the real danger. It was the line running parallel to it, deeper and more concealed, that mattered. Calder traced its approximate path with his gaze, imagining how the pressure from 8 men would strain it, how their combined weight might travel along the seam until the river decided it had carried enough. He had no intention of forcing anything directly. Instead, he relied on understanding the natural tipping point. The river didn't need much to shift from stability to instability. A single misstep on the wrong section could trigger a cascade of cracks that radiated outward. Calder had seen this happen before, though never under circumstances as tense as these. Once, years earlier, he had watched a mule step onto river ice that seemed solid, only to hear a low snap that echoed through the valley before the animal retreated quickly enough to avoid being caught. That memory rose now not as fear, but as insight.
The river had always followed patterns, and tonight the pattern favored him if he observed carefully. He took a slow step backward into deeper shadow, mindful of making no sound. The raiders were now at the river's edge. Their leader surveyed the frozen surface with a level of caution that suggested he understood some risks, but not all. Calder could tell by the man's stance that he was evaluating the distance and the apparent condition of the ice. The leader crouched briefly, perhaps testing the surface tension near the bank with a gloved hand. That amounted to little. The true danger lay farther out, where the dull gray patches hid their weakened structure. Yet, confident in their numbers, the raiders prepared to cross. Calder watched the leader's movements closely, noticing how he gestured to the others without speaking, signaling them to stay spaced out as they advanced. That spacing might help on thick ice, but it offered no protection from the river's deeper instability. He eased into a position where he could monitor the entire stretch. He considered how the weight distribution would unfold. If the raiders kept their formation, their collective pressure would radiate across the ice in a widening pattern. The leader's footfalls would contribute the initial strain. The men behind him would reinforce it. Calder imagined the sound that might follow, a slow, resonant moan that deepened as the river strained beneath uneven weight. He didn't welcome harm, but he understood the wilderness had its own rules, and the raiders, unaware of those rules, were walking directly into their consequences. The air grew colder, a shift that subtly altered the river's tension. Calder knew that a temperature drop could harden some areas while weakening others due to contraction. The ice might respond by tightening around its stronger seams while stretching the weaker ones further, creating minute fissures hidden beneath the surface. That contraction intensified the risk for anyone stepping across it. Calder breathed slowly, feeling the crispness of the air deepen with every exhale. He recognized that the window for the ice to act as an ally was narrowing. If the temperature dropped further, the ice might stabilize, but if the raiders crossed now, their movements would strike the river during its most vulnerable moment. He scanned the tree line again, remembering the fresh tracks he had found near his camp. The presence of another unseen figure complicated the situation, but he could not allow that uncertainty to distract him from the immediate threat moving toward the ice. He needed to remain fully aware of the river's subtle signals. He focused on the raiders' steps, monitoring the faint tremors that traveled through the frozen sheet. The vibrations were slight, but even those slight vibrations told him the ice was already beginning to respond. It didn't ground loudly, it didn't crack abruptly. It shifted quietly, the kind of early warning that only someone with years of experience might detect. The leader stepped nearer the weaker zone, his weight pressing into the surface with confident determination. Calder felt a soft vibration ripple outward, barely perceptible, yet clear to someone who had crossed countless rivers in harsh winters. That vibration signaled tension building along the fault line. The next few steps would force the river to decide how much it could bear. Calder steadied his breath, aware that the raiders were committed now, fully trusting the frozen surface beneath them. Just as the leader adjusted his stance for the next stride, the river released a faint but unmistakable sound, a deep, low creak that resonated through the ice like a quiet warning. It was subtle enough that the raiders didn't notice, but Calder heard it clearly, and he understood exactly what it meant. The ice had reached its threshold, and the night was ready to shift. Silence became Calder Reeves' sharpest instrument as the night pressed tighter around the frozen river. Not the fragile, passive quiet that settled on winter landscapes, but a deliberate silence shaped with purpose and intent. To Calder, silence wasn't simply the absence of sound. It was a field of awareness, a medium in which every decision had weight. On nights like this, silence revealed clues, concealed movement, and held the delicate balance between danger and safety. The raiders across the river relied on numbers and coordination, but Calder's strength lay in an understanding of the land's quiet spaces. He knew how silence amplified small details, turning each subtle vibration into a whisper of warning. That understanding had guided him through winters harsher than this one, and now it guided him as the raiders unknowingly stepped toward the weakened ice. The cold deepened with each passing moment, sharpening the edges of the landscape until even the slightest movement seemed loud enough to disturb the stillness. Calder understood that sound behaved differently in winter. Frozen air carried vibrations farther and clearer, and the ice beneath him acted like an unwitting amplifier. Even a shifting boot could echo across the river, betraying his position. With that in mind, he controlled every detail of his movement. His boots pressed lightly into the snow, distributing weight so evenly that the surface barely compressed. His breath flowed in slow, shallow streams that merged with the night rather than rising in visible clouds. His posture remained steady, avoiding sudden shifts that could snap a branch or scatter ice crystals underfoot. These small acts of discipline were not rehearsed techniques, but habits etched into him through years of navigating silent winter terrain. Calder's life as a trapper had taught him that silence was not only defensive, it was strategic. It shaped the way animals moved, revealing their paths and patterns. It allowed him to follow a fox's trail without disturbing the snow, or to approach riverbanks where beaver families gathered at dusk. Silence guided his steps, informed his instincts, and revealed truths hidden from those who assumed the wilderness was always loud. Tonight, it showed him the raiders' uncertainties as they tested the ice. Though they moved with practiced caution, their silence lacked the subtlety born from living alongside the land. Their movements carried tension, small hesitations, slightly uneven spacing, and shifts in weight that betrayed their unease. Calder didn't need to see their faces to know they were grappling with the invisible risks beneath their boots. He eased backward several inches, adjusting his position to maintain a clear vantage point. The ground responded with the faintest sound, a soft compression of snow that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Calder felt the texture, sensed how the crust settled beneath him, and recognized that even such a small sound could travel farther than intended. The river acted as a conduit for noise. A mere scrape could ripple across its frozen surface, alerting the raiders to movement on the opposite bank. His awareness sharpened as he paused, letting the stillness settle around him again before shifting another step. This kind of deliberate motion required patience, the kind most people lacked when adrenaline threatened to cloud judgment. But Calder leaned into the moment, allowing the discipline of silence to guide him. The air grew colder, closing in with a clarity that made every distant echo more distinct. Calder listened not only to the raiders' movements, but to the river's subtle shifts. The ice offered faint clues, tiny pops beneath distant layers, soft crackles where temperature changes tightened the surface, and the occasional whisper from the fault line in the center. He interpreted these sounds like notes in a score, each tone revealing how close the ice was to reaching its limit. The raiders remained unaware of these cues, their senses dulled by urgency and the confidence of their numbers. Yet Calder knew that silence was more than sound. It was also about awareness, of air pressure, of terrain, of how tension radiated through frozen landscapes. The more he listened, the clearer the night's hidden dynamics became.
He shifted again, this time angling himself behind a heavier patch of brush where shadows deepened. The placement allowed him to watch the raiders' progress while reducing the chance of being seen. From this vantage, Calder observed their leader steady himself at the edge of the weaker zone. The man crouched low, assessing the ice, unaware of the subtle vibrations that traveled back to Calder with each movement. Calder recognized the flaw in the raiders' strategy. They treated silence as a blank canvas, assuming it concealed them so long as they remained quiet. They didn't understand that silence also amplified the land's warnings. They lacked the attunement that allowed Calder to sense strain in the river long before it became visible. As the raiders prepared to step farther onto the ice, Calder focused on the small choices that would keep him ahead. He steadied his breathing, careful not to let excitement or fear disrupt his rhythm. He shifted his weight slowly, mindful that even the faint rustle of fabric could draw unwanted attention. He pressed closer to the brush, letting its natural contours break up the outline of his form. His mind remained clear, focused not on confrontation, but on ensuring that his presence remained undetected as the night played out. He had faced enough winters to know that panic led to mistakes, and mistakes led to outcomes no one intended. Silence became a form of protection as Calder controlled every sound within his reach.
It created a space in which he could anticipate the raiders' decisions, interpret the river's warnings, and adjust his strategy without drawing attention. He watched as the group reorganized, spreading out slightly as they moved deeper onto the frozen stretch. The leader remained vigilant, scanning the river, perhaps sensing a risk he couldn't fully identify, yet he lacked the nuanced understanding that Calder possessed. The raiders relied on tactics and numbers. Calder relied on experience and the land itself. As the group stepped farther, Calder noticed a faint shift in the ice, a gentle, elongated creak that traveled along the fault line. It was not loud enough to alarm the raiders, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years walking winter rivers. Calder felt the vibration resonate through the frozen surface and knew the ice was nearing its breaking point. Silence allowed him to sense it, to feel the tension growing with each step they took. The moment demanded stillness, it demanded patience, and Calder held both with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to trusting his instincts. Just as the leader adjusted his stance, a subtle change cut through the night. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in air pressure behind Calder, a presence moving lightly through the snow, too careful to be dismissed. The earlier tracks he had found near his camp resurfaced in his mind, connecting with the new disturbance. Someone else was out there, someone who understood silence nearly as well as he did. The raiders crept deeper onto the weakened ice, unaware of how close they were to its limits, but Calder's attention was drawn now to the darkened brush behind him. The land held its breath again, as if acknowledging that the night's balance had shifted. Someone was approaching, and this hidden presence would change everything before the river made its final decision.
Calder Reeves understood the difference between surviving a winter night and vanishing into it, often hinged on preparation carried out long before danger drew near. Tonight, every movement had to be measured, not out of fear, but out of respect for the terrain that could either protect him or betray him. The weakened stretch of ice beneath the raiders was no accident of nature alone. Calder had spent years studying rivers during freeze and thaw cycles, learning exactly where the current tended to thin the surface and how temperature shifts shaped the faint network of fractures. Now, with the raiders assuming they had surprise on their side, Calder positioned himself to let the river do what it naturally would, react to weight and strain in ways only someone who understood its seasonal rhythms could predict. He remained low behind the brush, the cold air slowing his breath until the night seemed to move through him rather than around him. The raiders stepped cautiously toward the central seam, their formation spreading slightly to distribute weight. They believed they were minimizing risk, but Calder had already recognized their miscalculation. Their spacing was inconsistent, causing stress to travel in uneven pulses across the surface. Each step created a ripple of tension that moved along the fault line like a drawn-out whisper. Calder felt those sudden tremors beneath his boots, each one confirming that the ice was nearing its threshold. Still, the river needed time. Pressure alone wouldn't cause the collapse. It required commitment. The raiders had to be fully on the weakened zone before the ice reacted. Calder angled himself 2 steps farther back, choosing a small rise in the snow that gave him an uninterrupted view of the crossing. From here, he could see the raiders' posture clearly. Their leader tested each step with a caution that revealed he sensed the risk but couldn't identify the source. That uncertainty rippled through the group in ways they didn't fully mask. A few glanced toward the shadows, as if expecting a presence. Others tightened their grip on their belongings, betraying tension they likely hoped to hide. Calder noted each subtle shift while keeping his own body still, letting silence cover him like an insulating layer. The river beneath the raiders carried its own rhythm, and Calder knew how to read it. The frozen surface, though solid near the banks, thinned rapidly toward the middle. Beneath it, the current pressed steadily, reshaping the integrity of the ice with every subtle fluctuation in temperature. Earlier that day, when a brief stretch of weak sunlight had warmed the surface before twilight temperatures plummeted, the ice had tightened too quickly. That rapid contraction created stress fractures now hidden beneath the glaze of moonlit frost.
Calder mapped their approximate pattern in his mind, recalling how similar conditions had behaved during past winters. The raiders were walking directly into that fragile zone without realizing it. He shifted his weight slightly, careful not to disturb the snow. The tension in the air felt different now, sharper and more concentrated. The raiders stood almost entirely within the vulnerable span. Calder watched the leader plant one foot firmly near the central seam. A faint tremor radiated outward, causing the dull gray patch of ice to flex ever so slightly. Calder recognized the movement at once. He braced internally, anticipating the next step in the ice's natural sequence. Unlike people, rivers didn't hesitate when they reached their limits. They responded with precise inevitability. Still, Calder needed to ensure his position remained safe. The snowbank he used for cover provided a decent buffer, but he wanted a vantage that allowed escape if anything unexpected occurred. He scanned the shadows behind him once more. The mysterious presence whose tracks he had discovered earlier lingered somewhere nearby. He sensed it rather than heard it, a disturbance in the otherwise predictable quiet. Whoever lurked in the tree line moved with skill, but not with the fluid silence that came from years of winter travel. Calder couldn't afford to ignore that variable. The unknown figure added a second layer to the night's unfolding tension, meaning he had to prepare for two separate risks: the raiders on the ice and the hidden observer who might be waiting for a moment of vulnerability.
The river groaned softly, a low resonance that carried across the frozen surface like a warning too subtle for untrained ears. Calder felt the vibration shift again, this time deeper, the kind that signaled the final stages of strain. The raiders remained unaware of the danger lurking beneath their boots. Their leader adjusted his stance, motioning for the group to keep moving. He appeared confident despite the uncertainty he couldn't fully name. Calder recognized that expression. He had seen it in travelers who underestimated terrain, believing caution alone would protect them. But caution without understanding was nothing more than guesswork. Calder tightened his focus as the raiders stepped forward again. The surface sagged faintly beneath them, almost imperceptible unless one knew precisely what signs to look for. A thin line of frost cracked along the surface, a shift that spread in a slow arc around the group's position. Calder felt the river's response through his boots, a subtle tremble that no longer hid its intentions. The ice was preparing to release. The sequence unfolded like a natural pattern he had seen before. Initial tension, followed by a quiet snap deep below the surface, then a ripple of stress radiating outward before the collapse. The moment demanded absolute stillness. Calder steadied his breathing and settled deeper into the brush, ensuring his silhouette vanished into the shadow. The raiders continued their slow advance, unaware that their collective weight had nearly exceeded the ice's tolerance. As they stepped farther, the river issued another low creak, more pronounced this time. It rolled along the fault line like a suppressed warning. The leader paused, sensing something but unable to interpret it. He scanned the riverbank and the tree line beyond, searching for a threat the darkness refused to reveal. Calder observed him closely. The man's instincts were sharp enough to detect unease, but not sharp enough to understand the river's quiet signals. He placed his foot down again, deeper this time, as though compensating for the uncertainty. That misjudgment sent a fresh wave of tension across the weakened span. Calder felt the vibration tighten, stretching the fault line to its limit. The raiders remained unaware of how close they stood to crossing the threshold between solid ice and the brittle layer beneath them. They had committed to the crossing, unaware that each step pressed them deeper into the river's natural trap. For a moment, the night held still, every sound suspended in anticipation. Calder leaned slightly forward, knowing the river's breaking point had arrived. The faint wind paused, the shadows settled, and the vibrations beneath the ice shifted into the unmistakable tone of imminent failure. Then, without warning, a sharp crack pierced the silence, racing across the river's surface like a signal. It was not loud, but it carried a distinct, decisive finality. And that single crack meant the river was about to respond.
The crack that sliced across the frozen river carried a tone Calder Reeves recognized instantly, a deep internal fracture rather than a surface break. It was the kind of sound that emerged only when ice reached the final edge of its tolerance, a warning that resonated through the night with quiet decisiveness. Calder held his breath and stayed completely still as the vibrations pulsed outward beneath the raiders' boots. The river had been patient, bearing their weight step by step, but the moment had come when it could carry no more. The slightest shift now would determine everything, and Calder felt the tension tighten like a drawn line ready to snap. He watched the raiders' formation stiffen, sensing that they had heard something, yet not understanding what it meant. Their uncertainty rippled through their posture, a hesitation reflected in how their leader leaned forward and scanned the surface for an explanation that the night refused to provide. The ice groaned again, this time with a strained undertone that revealed how closely the structure hovered between holding and failing. Calder knew that this sound came from deep within, from the point where the current pressed most forcefully against the underside of the weakened sheet. The raiders shifted their weight slightly, and that subtle movement sent a wave of pressure along the fault line. The brittle layer flexed, then steadied, then flexed again, each cycle more pronounced than the last. The river was behaving exactly as Calder had anticipated, following the same natural pattern he had watched unfold in previous winters whenever heavy loads ventured too far across fragile spans. The leader took one more cautious step, likely attempting to steady himself, but the movement concentrated pressure at the precise point where the river's internal balance had already begun to tip. Calder felt the change before he saw it, a soft trembling ripple that vibrated up through the snow beneath him.
The collapse began not with a dramatic break, but with a subtle shift, visible only to someone trained to notice fleeting details. The ice near the central seam sagged by less than an inch, but in that slight depression, Calder recognized the beginning of the river's final response. The sag deepened, stretching outward in an oval pattern around the raiders as the weak layer surrendered to the combination of weight and temperature stress. The men sensed movement beneath them, and several adjusted their stance instinctively, planting their feet more firmly. That adjustment, though natural, accelerated the process. The river could tolerate consistent pressure, but reacted sharply to sudden changes in distribution. Calder watched a thin fissure spread from the sagging area toward the downstream side, its progress marked by a faint line of shifting frost. The fissure widened silently at first, then released a single sharp pop that sliced through the air like a spark. The raiders' leader turned abruptly, scanning the surface again, but the river no longer held room for interpretation. The pop gave way to a deep, resonant crack that echoed through the valley, rolling across the banks in a low, decisive wave. The ice beneath the raiders split in a widening arc, opening from the center seam and curling outward as the structural integrity failed. Calder remained motionless, watching the river follow its natural sequence as the fracture widened with deliberate, inevitable force. The raiders scrambled instinctively, shifting their weight, but the collapse had already committed to its course. The sheet beneath them dipped sharply, creating a shallow trough that filled with dark water rising from the river below. The motion appeared slow in the moonlight, almost graceful, yet Calder understood the danger carried within that deceptively gentle movement. The ice folded inward as the central section gave way, forming a downward slope that indicated the river had fully broken through the weakened layer. The raiders attempted to step away from the sinking area, spreading out in an effort to reach more stable ground, but their movement came too late. The collapse was no longer a localized break, but a sequence spreading along the fault line, expanding like a seam unraveling under steady pressure. Calder focused not on the raiders themselves, but on the behavior of the river around them. Water surged upward through the widening gaps, dark and cold, reacting to the displaced surface. The ice flexed again, then fractured a second time, forming an intersecting split that stretched toward the upstream side. The raiders shifted once more, their movements hurried and disjointed. Calder knew that although the river's collapse was swift, it remained predictable in structure.
The central span would continue folding inward until the tension released completely, and the adjacent sections would absorb the remaining stress. His position on the bank ensured he stayed safely clear of the shifting surface. He moved only his eyes as he observed the progression. The broken section of ice rotated slightly under the tension, the edges curling upward as the heavy current beneath pushed against them. Calder noted how the river's pull interacted with the surface, predicting that the broken pieces would soon drift toward the deeper channel. He kept track of every pattern, knowing how essential it was to remain aware of terrain even when chaos unfolded. The collapse created a strange quiet, a stillness that followed the initial noise, as though the river held its breath after releasing tension built over days. The night air felt heavier, colder, as though the temperature had dropped immediately after the break. Calder steadied himself, letting the silence settle around him once more. The unknown presence that left tracks near his camp lingered in his thoughts, a reminder that the night carried more than one danger. The raiders' collapse on the ice was significant, but it did not explain who had circled near his shelter earlier. That person had moved with purpose, leaving tracks that suggested they had watched the river long before the raiders approached. Calder scanned the surrounding shadows, the brush line behind him and the tree line beyond the banks, listening for movement. The silence returned, thick and deliberate, as though the land itself paused to consider the next shift in the night. The last of the cracks settled into place, and the river regained its stillness. The moon reflected off the fractured surface in jagged patterns, bright against the dark water now exposed in the center. Calder waited, alert, knowing the night had not yet finished reshaping its course. The hidden presence remained unaccounted for, and he sensed the next turn approaching in the quiet breath of wind that drifted across the snow. Then a faint crunch sounded behind him, soft yet unmistakable. Someone else had arrived at the riverbank, and this new presence had chosen the moment immediately after the collapse to reveal their proximity. The faint crunch behind Calder Reeves carried a different quality from the sounds of settling frost or drifting snow. It was deliberate, slow, and measured, with a level of intent that made the silence around it sharpen instantly. Calder did not move. He let the sound settle into the night's rhythm, listening as the subtle shift repeated. Another careful step, light enough to avoid detection by an untrained ear, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years interpreting the wilderness by sound alone. Whoever followed him knew how to move in winter, yet their steps lacked the deep-rooted familiarity of someone raised within the land's silent discipline. Calder could sense hesitation in their cadence, as if they weighed each motion carefully, unsure how close they could draw without revealing too much. The moonlight stretched thin across the river, casting fractured reflections over the broken ice as the disrupted surface caught the pale glow. Calder remained still behind the brush, letting his breath slow as he focused on the subtle patterns emerging behind him. The night no longer held the predictable tension of a single threat. There were now two dynamics in motion: the retreat of the raiders from the fractured ice and the approaching figure who had tracked him with a precision that suggested a different purpose entirely. While the raiders moved with urgency and caution born of their recent shock, the unseen presence moved with steadiness, unaffected by the chaos on the river. That difference told Calder that their objective was separate from the raiders' intent. He shifted his gaze slightly, watching as the remaining raiders attempted to regain footing on the fractured edges. Though the collapse did not harm them, it disoriented them, disrupting their formation and pushing them toward the thicker ice near the western bank. They moved with brisk, uneven steps now, abandoning the earlier discipline that marked their approach. Their attention remained focused on regrouping, not on anything occurring on Calder's side of the river. This gave him a narrow window to assess the figure behind him without drawing unwanted attention from the fractured ice. He did not risk turning his head. Instead, he listened. The sound of snow compressing shifted again, only this time it came from his left rather than directly behind him. That detail mattered. Anyone familiar with pursuing a target in winter would remain directly behind them, using the target's tracks as cover. But this person avoided stepping in Calder's prints, choosing instead to walk along the outer edge of his path. That behavior indicated caution, perhaps even respect, but not inexperience. They were aware of their own noise and adjusted their path to keep distance. Trappers, scouts, and wanderers moved like that, individuals who understood the value of observation before action. Whoever this was, they did not intend confrontation, they intended positioning. The night remained quiet, except for the shifting ice downstream, where the river settled into new patterns following the collapse. Calder sensed that the raiders would remain preoccupied with regaining stable footing and assessing their situation. They had no reason to believe someone else watched from the opposite bank, hidden within shadow. Calder's attention drifted back to the presence on his side of the river. The snow carried their weight in slow intervals, each step deliberate. A brief pause suggested they had stopped to evaluate the scene, perhaps assessing the ruined crossing and the raiders' disrupted formation. That pause gave Calder the information he needed. Whoever stood behind him was not pursuing him with the raiders' aggressive precision. They were studying the river, the collapse, and possibly the path ahead. Calder weighed his next move. Silence had carried him through the earlier hours of the night, but now stillness served a different purpose. Remaining hidden gave him time to understand the intentions of the unseen figure. He knew that any abrupt motion might trigger a reaction. Instead, he grounded himself deeper into the concealment of the brush, letting the landscape shape the encounter. The moonlight glinted off the broken ice once more, shifting the patterns on the surface as the water beneath moved with a faint new current. That subtle change created an ambient sound that Calder could use as cover. He shifted barely an inch, aligning himself with a thicker shadow created by a slanted pine trunk. The movement made no sound beneath him, and he settled into the darker pocket. From this spot he could track the raiders' retreat while maintaining awareness of the stranger's approach. Another careful step came from behind him, slightly closer this time. The figure moved along the snow's edge with a quiet competency that set them apart from people unfamiliar with winter travel. Yet there was something subtle in their movement that tugged at Calder's attention, a faint irregularity in the pace, almost like someone adjusting to terrain they hadn't anticipated. Calder listened carefully, trying to decipher more from the sound alone. The footfalls carried a weight slightly lighter than that of the raiders, and the spacing indicated a stride more controlled, suggesting someone accustomed to maintaining balance on uneven ground. Calder considered the possibility that this was another trapper or scout, though the timing and trajectory of their approach suggested they had been following him specifically. The earlier tracks near his camp resurfaced in his mind, connecting with the present moment. The prints had shown weight distribution that suggested carrying gear, but moving with intention. That intention remained the unanswered question.
The figure stepped closer again, the snow compressing gently under them. Calder sensed that the stranger now stood within a distance where they could likely see the outline of his form if they focused sharply. The night's thin moonlight made shapes ambiguous, allowing the brush to blend with the terrain. Calder stayed still, letting the land do the work of concealment. He watched as the raiders gradually pulled back toward the tree line on the opposite bank, their disorganized retreat revealing that they had no immediate interest in crossing again. Their attempt had been shaken by the unexpected collapse, and they now moved with the uncertainty of men unsure whether the river would betray them twice. Calder allowed his attention to return fully to the presence behind him when he heard the snow compress again, this time accompanied by a faint shift of fabric. This was the movement of someone preparing to reposition themselves, perhaps seeking a clearer vantage of both the river and the man they had tracked. Calder sensed that if he waited much longer, the stranger might attempt to draw closer under the assumption that he hadn't noticed them. But he had noticed every step, every pause, and every shift in weight. The night felt as if it hovered on the edge of another change. The river had already reshaped itself, the raiders had lost their advantage, and the mysterious figure behind him now stood near enough that their breath would soon become visible in the moonlit cold if the night shifted only a few degrees. Calder remained composed, his instincts balancing stillness with readiness. Then a soft exhale drifted through the air, not loud, not urgent, but close enough that Calder knew the stranger had finally stopped moving. They were within reach of seeing him clearly now, and the moment they revealed themselves would determine the next turn in the night's unfolding story. The soft exhale behind Calder Reeves settled into the air with a weight that reshaped the night's balance. It carried no urgency, no trembling edge of aggression, yet its presence marked the stranger's first undeniable reveal. Calder did not turn toward the sound. He allowed the silence to stretch between them, letting the stranger decide the next shift.
The fractured river lay behind him, its broken surface glinting under the moon like shards of glass scattered across black water. The raiders had withdrawn into the tree line on the opposite bank, their movements uneven, their confidence fractured as thoroughly as the ice they had tried to cross. But Calder's attention moved beyond them now. The true tension lived on his side of the river, woven into the careful breath of someone who had approached with more patience than threat. The air thickened with winter stillness as Calder remained crouched behind the brush. The shadows there muted his form into the natural folds of the land, allowing him to observe without being exposed. His senses reached outward, extending through the quiet to map the location of the unseen figure. He caught the faint rustle of fabric shifting, the subtle adjustment of weight against snow, and the irregular rhythm of breath that suggested the stranger was measuring their own next move just as carefully as he was. Calder understood this kind of moment. It was the kind in which an entire night could tilt in one direction or the other, depending on a single motion. The moonlight stretched across the riverbank, illuminating the snow with a subdued radiance that sharpened edges and blurred deeper shadows. Calder knew that if he remained still, he could blend into the landscape long enough to let the stranger reveal either their intention or their mistake. But the land around him carried signals of change. The temperature continued to drop, giving the air a crystalline texture that made every sound sharper. And the river, though quiet now, shifted beneath its broken shell with a subtle current that would reshape the weakened edges by dawn. Calder had no intention of being caught in the open when the landscape changed again. He eased his weight backward with slow, deliberate care, shifting only as much as the terrain allowed without creating sound. The stranger did not move. The stillness suggested they were watching him or the space he occupied, trying to determine whether he had noticed them. Calder's instincts told him that this person was neither a hunter nor a raider. Their approach held caution rather than predation. They sidestepped rather than advance in a straight line. They avoided stepping in Calder's tracks, and their earlier movements, though quiet, carried a certain mild uncertainty, like someone attuned to silence but not hardened by countless winter crossings. Calder listened again, letting the patterns of the night return to him. The raiders' distant movement grew faint as they faded deeper into the trees, leaving only the stranger's presence as the dominant counterpoint to the river's soft murmurs. Calder's breath slowed further. If the stranger posed a threat, they would have used the collapse's chaos to close the distance. Instead, they hovered on the edge of exposure, as if waiting for Calder to initiate the next turn in the encounter. But he had learned long ago that winter nights did not reward impulsive action. Outrunning the night required restraint, awareness, and controlled movement. Calder rose gradually from his crouch, shifting his weight without breaking the flow of silence. The stranger did not react, with a step or sharp intake of breath. Only a subtle change in air pressure told him they noticed the adjustment. Calder kept his weight forward, avoiding the crunch of snow beneath his boots. He turned slightly, not enough to reveal his full silhouette, but enough to angle himself toward the slope leading into the denser timber. The pine hollow in that direction offered natural cover and a path that allowed quiet retreat. He had used that path before during winters when predators wandered too close, or when storms approached with little warning. The hollow would allow him to move without leaving a clear trail, using the wind-sheltered needles and uneven ground as a buffer. In a night where another silent walker moved nearby, that buffer mattered.
Calder took one more measured step, allowing the surrounding brush to absorb the sound. The stranger shifted again, but instead of advancing, they moved to the right, positioning themselves parallel to him rather than closing in. That behavior clarified something. This person wasn't driving him toward a trap. They were reacting to him, adjusting based on his direction. The dynamic hinted at someone avoiding confrontation rather than seeking it. Perhaps they were studying him, or perhaps they were caught in the night's events by circumstance. Calder had encountered travelers before who followed quietly out of caution rather than intention. But something about this situation differed. The stranger had followed him long before the collapse, tracking him with steady purpose. The night seemed to pulse with held breath as Calder continued toward the pine hollow. The moon dipped slightly behind a thin veil of clouds, softening the sharp light and blending the shadows even deeper. Calder moved with the landscape, letting the terrain eat the sound of his steps.
He avoided branches that would crack underfoot, choosing snow that had settled evenly rather than crusted layers that fractured with a crisp snap. The stranger's footsteps followed again, quiet enough to match his caution, but still discernible to him. Their pace matched his, keeping distance without closing it. Calder recognized that they understood the rhythm of pursuit on winter ground, yet they avoided the hallmarks of aggression. This kind of measured shadowing usually belonged to someone seeking clarity, not conflict. As he reached the rise before the hollow, Calder paused just long enough to listen for the raiders. They were gone now, only faint echoes of their disrupted retreat lingered in the distance. The river, free of their weight, settled into a new equilibrium, the fractured edges forming patterns that would freeze solid again by morning. Calder turned his attention back toward the stranger, who had paused as well. He heard no motion, only the soft presence of breath drifting through the cold. The air around them grew stiller, as if the night itself held open a narrow passage through which only necessary choices could pass. Then Calder sensed something unexpected. The stranger shifted lightly again, but their movement carried a rhythm different from pursuit. It was the small, careful repositioning of someone who feared being misinterpreted. The sound held restraint rather than intent. It matched the kind of step someone took to avoid startling a wary animal. Calder held still, letting the realization settle with the cold. This person had not been following him to corner him at all. They had been following him to avoid stepping into danger they could not fully see. The pine hollow lay only a few strides ahead, its shadows offering a safe transition away from the open bank. Calder moved toward it with steady caution. The stranger remained behind him, quiet but present. And as he slipped into the darker fold of the pines, he sensed the night preparing for one more turn, one shaped not by the raiders nor by the river, but by the moment the stranger finally chose to reveal themselves. The pine hollow received Calder Reeves with a quiet that felt older than the land itself. The canopy above him filtered the moonlight into dim ribbons, softening the world into muted shades of gray and silver. Snow lay thicker here, preserved in untouched drifts beneath the shelter of heavy boughs. Calder paused just inside the tree line, allowing the quiet to settle across his shoulders like a familiar weight. The night had shifted many times already, and now, as the hours crept toward dawn, the silence grew even more deliberate. He sensed the stranger still behind him, lingering at the threshold of the open riverbank, unsure whether to continue forward or remain hidden in the receding glow of the broken ice.
Calder stayed perfectly still, letting the hollow's natural acoustics guide his awareness. The pines outside creaked softly in the faint wind, each branch bending with the cold. A distant snap echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest, not the sharp sound of pursuit, but the natural settling of wood under thick frost. He listened for any sign of the raiders, though he already suspected they had retreated far beyond the river by now, their confidence fractured and their path disrupted. But the stranger remained. Each breath they released drifted into the hollow as a faint pulse of warmth against the cold. Calder focused on that breath, analyzing its rhythm and spacing, searching for any indication of intention. The stranger lingered at the edge for several moments, and Calder imagined them studying the hollow the way he had studied countless spaces before stepping into them. Eventually, a soft crunch signaled their decision as they crossed the boundary into the pines. The snow beneath their feet compressed lightly, revealing a level of care that matched Calder's earlier observations. Yet even with such controlled steps, there was something tentative in their movement, a subtle measure of caution suggesting they approached not out of pursuit, but out of uncertainty. Calder adjusted his stance slightly to remain partly concealed behind a thick trunk, allowing himself the advantage of shadow. He had no interest in surprising the stranger, but he needed to understand their purpose before revealing his own position. The hollow invited stillness, and Calder allowed its rhythm to guide the moment. The stranger moved deeper, stopping several paces behind him. Their breath drifted into the still air again, gaining a faint tremor as if shaped by the cold or by the weight of whatever purpose had driven them here. Calder knew the night had tested every instinct he possessed, yet the stranger's presence now introduced a new kind of tension, one not born of threat but of unspoken reasoning.
He considered revealing himself, but years of living on the frontier taught him that timing mattered as much as intention. Instead, he took one step forward, his movement almost imperceptible in the hush of snow. That shift sent a thin crackle through the frost beneath his boot, a small sound made deliberately to acknowledge his awareness without inviting confrontation. The stranger froze at the sound, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Calder could almost hear their thoughts, the careful evaluation, the attempt to determine whether his step was a warning or an invitation. When the stranger finally shifted again, it was with a slow exhale, followed by a step forward, the sound barely audible. Calder listened more closely than ever. The footfall revealed something new. They carried weight evenly, balanced and measured, but lacked the deep-set rhythm of someone accustomed to crossing ice at night. This person was competent, but not hardened. That difference mattered. Someone moving with survival instinct alone would have forced hurried decisions. Someone moving with confidence born of skill would have approached without hesitation. But this stranger walked between those extremes, caught in the middle of observation and caution. Calder allowed the silence to stretch, trusting the moment to shape itself. The night air grew colder still, carrying a clarity that hinted at dawn's approach. A faint pale band appeared along the eastern horizon, where the forest thinned toward the foothills. Calder recognized the shift instinctively. Dawn approached with a slow, deliberate glow that would soon brighten the hollow and reveal everything the night had concealed. The stranger must have sensed the change as well. They shifted again, this time with a small, hesitant step that sounded more like a question than a decision. Calder considered the dynamics of the night as he prepared to address the unspoken tension. The raiders had been turned back not by confrontation, but by the land's natural logic. The river's collapse had reshaped the balance of threat and safety without physical struggle. The stranger's presence, too, had followed a pattern distinct from conflict. Their tracking had been careful rather than forceful, their timing deliberate rather than opportunistic. Calder knew the final understanding could only emerge through the silence's natural unraveling. He stepped forward again, this time allowing a bit more sound into the motion. The snow responded with a gentle crunch that broke the stalemate. The stranger remained still for a heartbeat, then edged closer. Not enough to close the distance fully, but enough to reveal that they sought clarity rather than concealment. Calder let the moment settle before shifting once more, turning slightly so the first threads of dawnlight caught the outline of his form. He did not step into full visibility. He simply allowed the stranger to see enough to understand he was aware, prepared, but not defensive. The stranger exhaled again, and Calder heard relief in the sound. Not deep relief, but a subtle easing of tension that suggested the night's uncertainty had carried weight for them as well. That soft exhale marked a transition, a signal that the stranger had made a decision about how this encounter should unfold. They took 2 more steps, their movements slow and quiet, until the narrow beam of emerging dawn finally broke across their silhouette through the branches. Calder did not recognize the stranger, but the posture revealed enough. They stood with shoulders slightly forward, breath steadying, hands visible and away from their body as if to show they carried no intention of forcing conflict. Their clothing bore marks of winter travel, frost at the edges, snow packed lightly into the folds, but not the heavy wear of raiders or seasoned trackers. Calder watched them in the pale half-light, reading the details of their presence with the same attention he had given the river's cracks. He saw uncertainty without malice, purpose without aggression. Whatever reason had brought them into the night was tied to observation, perhaps necessity, but not threat. The first true band of dawn broke over the horizon, stretching a soft golden-gray glow through the hollow. It revealed the shape of the land around them and softened the tension that had bound the night so tightly. The stranger remained still, watching Calder in quiet acknowledgement. Calder, in turn, let the moment breathe, recognizing that the night had offered them both lessons different from the danger posed by the river and the raiders. As the light strengthened, Calder understood something with a clarity as steady as the morning's first warmth. The frontier did not measure survival solely in the avoidance of danger. It measured survival in the choices made when danger shifted, in the restraint shown when instinct urged haste, and in the understanding that not every shadow carried threat. The stranger had followed him through the night, seeking safety rather than confrontation, and Calder, guided by years of listening to the land's subtle cues, had allowed the silence to reveal what needed revealing. The day was beginning, and with it came the quiet truth that the frontier granted survival to those who respected its rhythms. But as Calder faced the stranger in the soft light of dawn, Calder understood something with a clarity as steady as the morning's first warmth. The night had left a question hanging in the cold air, a question that would shape whatever came next. And the cost of the night's choices, though unseen now, would reveal itself in time. A lone trapper didn't survive that frozen Montana night through strength, but through awareness, listening to the land when others ignored it. Calder Reeves proved that the frontier always favored those who understood its silence rather than those who tried to overpower it. And even today, his story reminds Americans that calm observation often outmatches force, noise, and confidence. In a world full of rush, the quietest person still sees the path first. If stories like this frontier night pulled you in, stick close. There are countless more hidden moments waiting to be uncovered. Let this tale travel far by passing it along to anyone who still believes the land has lessons to teach. And if you want to be here when the next untold chapter rises from the wilderness, make sure you're part of the camp before the next dawn breaks. The frontier has more secrets, and we're just getting started.